Russian forces' failure near Mirnograd, attempts to capture Pokrovsk, and losses suffered by the Russian army as a result of local assaults. This is the War Map, live on Freedom. I'm Oleg Borisov. Hello. Let's discuss the situation in more detail in the Pokrovsk direction, specifically in the Mirnograd area. Despite the fact that logistics in this area are complicated, Ukraine's defense forces are fully supplied. This was reported by the East Military Group. Russian occupiers are trying to attack and take control of Mirnograd, but they are unable to do so, as the Ukrainian Armed Forces are holding the line and inflicting significant damage on the enemy. The Russians' current objective is the northern part of Mirnograd, since that's where the highest number of attacks is being recorded. Next, we'll discuss the situation in Pokrovsk in more detail. According to the Ukrainian General Staff, this is where the highest number of clashes is taking place. Just in the past 24 hours, there have been more than 70 of them. Meanwhile, analysts from the American Institute for the Study of War have noted that although Russian activity continues, their offensive potential has decreased. This is because the Ukrainian armed forces keep the Pokrovsk direction under fire control and physically prevent the Russians from gaining a foothold here. Russian propaganda and dictator Putin himself previously claimed that Pokrovsk was surrounded. But the Ukrainian General Staff has refuted these statements. The fighting continues, and Ukraine's defense forces are putting up a tough resistance. Next, let's talk about the Kursk direction. Ukrainian defenders are holding positions on the territory of the Russian Federation. This was reported by the spokesperson for the Kursk military group. According to him, the situation is under control and stable. The Russians have become less active here. They are launching assaults in groups of 2 to 4 people without using heavy equipment. And mercenaries from North Korea are now crossing into Ukraine and remain in the second line. But where the Russians have become more active in this direction is in air attacks, specifically using aerial bombs. On average, they carry out about 15 airstrikes daily. Next, let's talk about the situation in the Kramatorsk and Sloviansk directions. Here, the Russians are not conducting active operations, but they constantly launch drone and missile attacks on the city, causing civilian casualties. Russian attacks have been recorded near the settlements of Dranivka, Serebryanka, Ivanodaryevka, and Fedorovka. All attacks were repelled, the occupiers suffered losses and retreated. Next, let's discuss the situation in the Kupiansk direction. President of Ukraine Volodymyr Zelensky reported that defense forces have advanced 1,000 to 1,200 meters in this region. Meanwhile, the 429th Separate Achilles Regiment showcased the results of their work. In this video, drone operators struck 4 self-propelled artillery units, a multiple rocket launcher system, and a Strela-10 air defense system. These are difficult targets because the Russians do their best to camouflage them, and losing such equipment makes it harder for the occupiers to maintain their offensive potential. Now, let's discuss this and other topics in more detail with Dmytro Snayev, a military and political analyst. Dmytro, hello. We'd like to hear the latest information from you about Mirnograd and the Pokrovsk direction in general. Please, go ahead.
In recent days, Russian occupation forces have sharply increased the number of clashes in the Pokrovsk direction. But the main information being published, both by Russian public channels and, accordingly, by Western media reports about the alleged tactical and operational encirclement of the Ukrainian group in Pokrovsk and in the Mirnograd area, does not correspond to reality. At the moment, the most intense fighting in Pokrovsk continues in the industrial zone. This is the area around the meat processing plant and the feed mill. It should be noted that in the area of responsibility of the 7th Air Assault Corps, about 250 Russian occupiers have been eliminated in just the past week. There is a similar number of wounded. I want to draw attention to the number of destroyed vehicles and motorcycles. More than 30 units. This clearly shows that the occupiers are trying to use vehicles and motorcycles to break through the so-called drone wall. In other words, the kill zones that Ukraine's defense forces used to hold back further advances by the Russian occupiers. At the moment, the occupiers are trying to expand their presence in the area of the so-called high-rise buildings. In other words, they're trying to use the high-rise sector as commanding heights to establish fire control over the positions of Ukraine's defense forces. By order of the Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, Syrsky, additional operational reserves have been deployed to the Pokrovsk direction, including special units from the main intelligence directorate of the Ministry of Defense of Ukraine, Special Operations Forces, and other components of Ukraine's defense forces. Our special forces have largely succeeded in unblocking the logistics of the armed forces of Ukraine, and have not allowed the occupiers to close the encirclement ring in the Pokrovsk area. It should also be noted that, according to the Russian side itself, as reported by Russian correspondent Maxim Kalashnikov, the losses of the Russian occupiers in Pokrovsk are comparable to the number of losses during the battles for BAKHMUT. And let me remind you, at that time the Russian occupiers lost about 90,000 personnel. In other words, if the occupiers admit to catastrophic losses, it means that at this point they are unable to capture Pokrovsk, even at the cost of so-called human wave assaults. Moreover, it is worth noting that the occupiers themselves are admitting this fact. The lack of an operational encirclement has led to a change in tactics, specifically the tactic of pushing Ukrainian defense forces out of Pokrovsk directly within the urban area. And let me remind you, urban combat is high-intensity fighting, where the loss ratio for the attacking side is several times higher. The loss ratio for the side that is actively defending is much lower. That's the situation in Pokrovsk. Now, about Mirnograd. The occupiers are trying to attack. The positions of the Ukrainian defense forces directly in Mirnograd itself, using the 5 to 6 mine administration as their main base for amassing operational reserves. At the moment, once again, all reports by Russian media claiming that Mirnograd is under operational encirclement do not correspond to reality. The logistics of the Ukrainian defense forces have been established. They are rotating personnel and delivering ammunition. Moreover, the occupiers have been forced to acknowledge the tactical successes of the Ukrainian defense forces in the Dobropillia direction, specifically in the Shakov area. The Ukrainian defense forces have effectively put Russian groups in the so-called Dobropillia salient under threat. In other words, we are talking about flanking strikes by the Ukrainian defense forces and the threat of creating an operational encirclement for Russian units in this area. The main fighting is currently taking place for the settlement of Rodinsk, which is a key logistical hub for our defenders. And the occupiers are forced to acknowledge the fact of the Ukrainian defense forces' successful actions at this moment, both in unblocking logistics and, accordingly, in carrying out successful counteroffensive operations to prevent further advances by the occupiers along the flanks of the Pokrovsk group.
The Ukrainian Defense Forces' attacks on Russian oil refineries are ongoing. Share the results and consequences. We're interested in your analysis.
Special Operations Forces drones have struck oil refineries and oil storage facilities in occupied Crimea for the third time in the past 2 weeks. Specifically, we're talking about Special Operations Forces drones hitting the Vardiisk oil depot in occupied Crimea. It should be noted that Special Operations Forces drones hit the pumping station on the territory of the oil depot. In addition, let me remind you that just a few days ago, on the 6th to be exact, Special Operations Forces already struck the Vardiisk oil depot. Furthermore, drones of the Special Operations Forces of the Ukrainian Defense Forces. On the 6th, they struck a number of oil depots and fuel storage facilities in Simferopol and its outskirts. On November 8th, the Ukrainian Defense Forces carried out a series of strikes on oil refining facilities on the territory of the Russian Federation. In particular, according to Russian sources, strikes were carried out on the Ryazan oil refinery. And let me remind you of the further course of events. On November 5th, Special Operations Forces attacked the Volgograd oil refinery with drones. It should be noted that this oil refinery is one of the largest on the territory of the occupying country. This plant is capable of processing about 16 million tons of oil per year. That's about 6% of all oil refining in the territory of the occupying country. Explosions and fires were recorded in the area of the oil refining facility. It should also be noted that Special Operations Forces drones have repeatedly struck this legitimate military target on the territory of the occupying country. For example, on September 18th, Special Operations Forces drones attacked this facility, and at that time the Russian side was forced to confirm a partial shutdown of the facility's operations. After the most recent attack by Special Operations Forces on this oil refinery, the Russian side announced a complete halt of the production cycle. In addition, let me remind you of the subsequent course of events. On the 4th, drones from the Special Operations Forces and, accordingly, the main intelligence directorate of the Ministry of Defense of Ukraine carried out a series of strikes using attack drones on one of the largest oil refineries in Russia, specifically the Nizhny Novgorod refinery. It should also be noted that this refinery, its nominal capacity is about 17 million tons of oil processed per year. The facility produces more than 50 types of products. These include automotive, aviation, and diesel fuels, as well as products for military use. This set of data allows us to say that the systematic strikes by the Ukrainian Defense Forces, the Special Operations Forces, and the main intelligence directorate of the Ministry of Defense of Ukraine are primarily aimed at blocking the main budget-forming sector of the Russian Federation, namely oil refining enterprises. Let me remind you, up to 40% of the Russian budget depends on oil dollar revenues. And let's also recall the corresponding attack on the Saratov oil refinery on the 3rd. November 3rd. Drones from the main intelligence directorate of the Ministry of Defense of Ukraine and the Special Operations Forces struck one of the largest and oldest oil refineries on Russian territory. Its processing volume is about 6 million tons. And it's worth noting that this refinery is almost entirely responsible for the logistics of the occupying army. In addition to this, I'll also mention a series of drone strikes by the Special Operations Forces in the occupied territories of Luhansk region. Specifically, we're talking about the destruction of a fuel and lubricants depot in occupied Dalshansk in the settlement of Roskishin, which is a suburb of Luhansk. As we can see, Ukraine's defense forces are systematically working to disrupt the logistics of the occupying army. And most importantly, let's talk about the consequences of these Ukrainian strikes. According to Russian estimates, the total losses to the Russian economy as a result of successful drone strikes by the Special Operations Forces of the main intelligence directorate of Ukraine's Ministry of Defense amount to around $100 billion. More than 80 regions of the Russian Federation have felt the impact of the fuel crisis. That is,
So, Dmitry, am I right in understanding that despite the fact that the Russian Federation wanted to deprive Ukraine of its overall defense capability, am I correct in saying that Ukraine's long-range capabilities and defense capacity are actually developing and only getting stronger?
yes, absolutely right. Moreover, there have been reports about a possible strike using Ukrainian Flamingo drones against oil storage facilities in Twops. As confirmation, the Russian side is publishing objective control data, specifically the locations where Ukrainian ballistic missiles have landed. and the Russian side itself notes the fact that the strikes were not carried out by Bober drones, but rather involved Ukrainian ballistic missiles, considering the range required to hit the target. This is already a serious development in terms of paralyzing the oil refining complex of the Russian Federation, specifically further. Strikes on oil refining facilities using Ukrainian ballistic missiles. Let me remind you of the tactical and technical characteristics of the Flamen. It has a range of 3,000 kilometers and, accordingly, a warhead weighing 150 tons. And let me remind you of the words of the Ukrainian president, who said that the Ukrainian defense industry will scale up the production of Ukrainian ballistic missiles by the end of the year. In other words, what we're talking about is that the Ukrainian side has essentially found the most vulnerable spots in the Russian economy, oil refining enterprises and, accordingly, energy sector enterprises. And at this point, the Russian side is already experiencing serious difficulties in supplying fuel and lubricants to the Russian occupation army. And, as a result, social tension is rising both in Russia and across the territory of the Russian Federation.
Dmitry, thank you so much for taking the time to join us on air. Dmitry Snegerev, military and political analyst, was with us live.
Subscribe to UATV English and stay updated on the most important events, top news from Ukraine and all over the world, in-depth analysis, exclusive reports and interviews, all on hand in our channel. Join our community of viewers and stay tuned.